When I was doing the post-race interviews for F1, it was right at the start. I was there when Lewis won his first Grand Prix and Indianapolis as well in 07. And he and I was thinking of ways to try to get him to talk about his spiritual strength and how much it means to him without doing it in a crass way. But with Lewis, it was never crass. It was always, I just feel very, very lucky to be doing what I'm doing. And I say a little prayer every day to thank God for what I've been given, and I just want to make the most of it. And I can't believe that the risk they took with Leclerc was to put him on Inters early. What they should have done is said, right, forget about the Inters. We're going to give him track position and leave him on the slicks. He's good enough and he's talented enough to be able to drive this thing on slicks. And if we can get him through that whole period, then he might have decent track position. Max has earned that position, that right to be the strength in the team, just as Lewis had earned that right. And that's one of the things I've always said, he earned that right to be able to say, I want to keep Valtteri in the other car. And they didn't do it. And that's one of the things he had to live with after Abu Dhabi 21.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the F1 Hour. With me as always, my friend and yours, the goatiest F1 mind to have ever goated, the legend that is Peter D. Windsor. How are you keeping, sir?
I'm very well, Cameron. Yeah, nice Monday morning to wake up to, isn't it? I remember as a kid having to go back to school on a Monday morning, having been at my local racetrack, Warwick Farm in Sydney, Australia, after watching any given race meeting, but probably, Frank Matic, Frank Gardner, some really good guys. And I had this horrendous feeling on a Monday morning of having to go back to school. And I remember, I don't know what age I was, probably about 13. I remember thinking, when I grow up, I want to have a job where I never feel bad on Monday mornings. And that meant working in motor racing. And I'm lucky because I've had that all my life, really. Monday mornings to me feel just as good as Sunday mornings or Saturday mornings. And this Monday morning feels particularly good, waking up, thinking about that race yesterday and how Lewis probably feels this morning as well with that trophy by his bed, no doubt.
Oh, shall we talk about it, Peter? Because it was an emotional one for me as a Sir Lewis Hamilton fan. In your brilliant video summarising the events of yesterday, you said that it was an emotional groundswell, that event became something greater than the sport, greater than the sum of its parts, that it was a human victory. What do you mean by that, Peter?
Well, I think that race, the more with the benefit of time we look at it, it's only just sinking in really, but I think that win needs to be seen as the pivotal win that it is. If you look at it in terms of where it's come from Abu Dhabi 21. And a lot of the people in those grandstands at Silverstone experienced Abu Dhabi 21, certainly from afar, but they experienced it and they went through it with Lewis, I think, and what that meant. Losing a champion, it's a huge thing that happened at Abu Dhabi 21. We should never underplay how big that is.
Yeah.
And then I think simultaneously, it's the future as well. And you've got him leaving Mercedes at the end of the year, going to Ferrari, arguably the biggest name in the sport, although you'd have to say maybe the Hamilton name is now bigger than the Ferrari name, who knows. Be interesting to do a survey on that one. That one would be an interesting survey. And you've got him winning at Silverstone of all places prior to going to Ferrari, signing off, if you like, with the British fans from his career at Mercedes and going to this, the next team. So he's driven for McLaren, Mercedes, and now he's going to Ferrari. And so I think that win yesterday was right in the middle of that transition between the past and the legacy of Abu Dhabi 21 and the sort of horrendous situation in which he had to go through, not only losing the championship, but having to say goodbye to Valtteri as a teammate, which was a big thing. And thirdly, an uncompetitive car from day one for 2.5 years. And that was a huge thing. And to keep his motivation and to keep his love of driving and love of racing, love of Formula One, if you like, despite all that, and still continue to be Lewis Hamilton, it was an amazing achievement, I think, to have got that to that point. And now looking forward, imagine now how the Italians feel about Lewis joining Ferrari. and how Lewis feels about joining Ferrari, especially if Adrian's going to be there. I don't know for sure, but if he is, think about that. He's never driven, I don't think he's ever driven an Adrian Newey car, has he? Because Adrian had left for Red Bull 2 years before Lewis joined McLaren. And maybe there was a bit of Adrian in that first McLaren he drove, not much, I wouldn't have thought. And then it's been Adrian versus Lewis, if you like. Adrian's won 13 championships, I think, in his career, 14 this year, you got to assume. Lewis has won 7. So they are the two winningest people in the history of Formula One. And imagine those two finally getting together if Adrian does go there. I mean, it's a whole thing, and it's taken on huge new proportions now, I think, as a result of that win at Silverstone.
Mr. Windsor, there's a very many threads at which I want to pull there. Talk to me about how Lewis Hamilton got that done. Again, you spoke in your video, if I can reference it. You said of Lewis that his touch was Prost-like, that he leveraged mechanical empathy to get those tyres to the end, to manage the gap between him and Max Verstappen. What is it about Sir Lewis Hamilton that differentiates him from the other 19 on the grid? How does he get that sort of thing done, Peter?
Yeah, I wouldn't say he's the only one. In other words, one of 20. I would say Max is there, and on his day now, you got to have that prefix. Charles is probably there. And Lando, in his way, is not that far apart from them. But what Lewis does innately so well, and I say innately because obviously it's a natural talent, and he's always had it since the karting days. But nonetheless, it's a natural talent that he's nurtured and protected and looked after, despite the infiltrations of fame, fortune, data, the number of excuses that racing drivers can make, because there are so many aspects to the engineering of the car. And we saw that today. We were just reading it out before the show, the press release from Daniel Ricciardo. Everything was, we didn't have a good day, we need to do better. It wasn't like, I didn't have a good day, I need to do better, because Yuki Tsunoda didn't do that badly. It was always we. So, and racing drivers love to sort of surround themselves in this massive excuse of all the things that can go wrong that are not their fault at all. But I don't think Lewis has ever done that. And I don't think Max ever does that either. The great drivers don't do that. They're very realistic, even if they don't talk in sound bites that the media perhaps want. Deep down inside, you know that they know exactly what they need to do in order to be quick. And if they're not doing it, they're telling themselves to get on with it. And that's what Lewis does so well. So getting back to the point, the fact that at Silverstone, in those changeable conditions, when the thing was, it wasn't only the wet to dry, it was also crosswind and gusts. It was all sorts of things going on. And that's where Lewis has always been exceptionally good. And it's because he's got this very light touch on the car, and he does let the car float, as I was pointing out in my qualifying vid, when we saw how long he was holding 8th gear going into Beckett's, whereas George was getting 7th sooner. That neither of them were braking, got to make that point. But we're talking 290 kilometers an hour, quick stuff, entry to Beckett's. And George is just leaning on the torque of the engine just to sort of give him a solid feel to the left rear. Whereas Lewis is going in, just floating in 8th, just letting the car settle, working the tires more, all 4 tires square to the road. And that is the key. It's having those 4 tires square to the road, which then enables him to have a more stable platform to manipulate the cars to what it's going to do next. The minute you've got more load than perhaps you need, because that's the way you like to drive, that's when you're more prone to making a small mistake if there is a sudden gust, or if it's a little bit wet on that little bit of curb that you didn't hit the lap before. And that's what Lewis has done so well. And the fact that he still has that talent, and as obvious as it was, I think, at Silverstone, is a great tribute to his to the way he lives his life. What can I say? It's incredible how he's managed to protect this great talent that he has and not let it be colored too much by all the other stuff around him. I think also, and I don't know how to bring this into any conversation about Lewis, but I think he's also very strong spiritually. And when I was doing the post-race interviews for F1, it was right at the start. I was there when Lewis won his first Grand Prix and Indianapolis as well in 07. And he and I was thinking of ways to try to get him to talk about his spiritual strength and how much it means to him without doing it in a crass way, which often you see after big sports events, particularly, well, I won't give any examples at all because it wouldn't be appropriate, but you often see it kind of, it's a bit crass. But with Lewis, it was never crass. It was always, I just feel very, very lucky to be doing what I'm doing. And I say a little prayer every day to thank God for what I've been given, and I just want to make the most of it. And I think that little phrase has driven him throughout his career. And I think what we saw yesterday was nothing more than the exemplification of that. It was that. It was that little thing of I'm very lucky to be here, very lucky to be in front of this crowd, very lucky to be in a good racing car finally, and I really appreciate how good it is after 2.5 years of rubbish. I'm going to make the most of it. And I think it's as simple as that. I really do. I think he's got this very strong spiritual belief. And that's why he's been able to stay on the straight and narrow for so long, despite all those world championships.
Wow. Reminiscent of a couple different people there, Peter, as far as that spirituality that's kept him going for so very long. Senna springs to mind, but I want to take your mind back. You cited 1992 and Mansell again, another very famous home victory. Were you reminded of that, Peter? And what sticks out in your mind as far as Mansell back in 1992? And again, one of super emotional, right? A proper human moment.
Yes, I mean the similarities there. I mean, in terms of the race, completely different, of course, but the similarities are the campsites and the flags and you know, how can I put this? The normal everyday Formula One fan that was attracted to Nigel, and Nigel always acknowledged them and loved them. And it's the same with Lewis. You know, he makes a point of it. And you know, I've got journalist friends who think it's a show, and in Lewis is doing it just to sort of, you know, more publicity and this and that. I don't buy that. I think Lewis genuinely feels not an obligation, but he definitely feels gratitude to all those fans. He really does. And it is, you know, it's the campsite, it's the people that get wet on the Saturday night when it's raining, staying overnight at Silverstone, the people with the hole in the tent, it's the people in the mud, it's those people. And that's exactly the same as it was in Nigel's era in 92, exactly the same thing. It was the BRDC campsite. It was the campsite on the other side of the road. And that's what makes Silverstone very different from most circuits. Austria used to be like that, and not quite as much today, but used to be like that. Nürburgring used to be like that. But Silverstone, more than any other circuit now, I think has more campers probably watching it and staying over for the weekend than any other race on the calendar.
Blimey. Now let's talk about Maximilian Verstappen, Peter, because I think he's at something of a crossroad as far as how he's driving that car and the performance that car's giving him. He said a gazillion times now that if he's to stay the course at Red Bull, his contract coming to expire in 2028, that he's going to need two things. The first is an extent of harmony within the team. The second is a car capable of winning races. As at July 2024, Peter, how many of those two things does Maximilian Verstappen have?
I think the first comment is probably related to some of the unrest that's been at Red Bull recently, and that seems to be settling down now, doesn't it? So I can't imagine that's still a talking point. As for the second, it's an obvious point. I mean, who doesn't want to have a great car? And Max is no different from any other racing driver. And obviously in his mind, there's a question mark, as it is in everybody's mind, how Red Bull will be without Adrian Newey and how good a car they will produce as time goes on. As I said before, I think there's enough momentum and enough infrastructure from the Adrian era for Red Bull very competitively to get through to the end of 2025. How then the new car will perform against the new Ferrari, the new Mercedes is another question, and that's obviously a question in Max's mind. So he will never ever at this point, because he's an intelligent guy, he'll never say, "Oh yeah, I just love Red Bull. I'm going to be there forevermore." What he said is not surprising and completely logical. You know, he obviously does want a good car, and as I said before, you know, if the Red Bull isn't a good car, he's not going to be short of other teams to go to, even if those teams have to get rid of their existing driver and buy Max in. You know, there are plenty of teams out there with the money to be able to do that. So he's in a great position and he's earned that position. And Lewis has taken the opportunity given to him to go to Ferrari, which is a great call as well. So nothing surprising about that. I think yesterday you can look at Max's day in two ways. You can either say, wow, he was really struggling early on. And what was that? Was that Max? Was that the car? No grip? Because suddenly it didn't look too bad at the end of the race on the hard tires. Or you could say, wow, what a drive by Max Verstappen. A really difficult car. Look where Perez was with it, P5, P6 when, it was on full tanks, but he managed to bring that thing home in second place, a classic Max Verstappen drive. There are two ways of looking at it. And if you look at Max's stats, I mean, one of his great qualities over the years, ever since he's been in Formula One, even starting with Toro Rosso, has been his ability to finish well on the podium with a difficult car. He's very, very good at that. And I take the latter view. I think he did a really good job yesterday in what was obviously not the best car at Silverstone at that over the weekend. He did a really good job. It would have been interesting if he'd been on mediums at the end rather than the hard tire to see how quick he would have been. I'm assuming they didn't have any mediums, and that's why I ran the hard. I haven't actually done my homework on that point.
I think Max only had fresh hards. Lando Norris, on the other hand, Peter, had fresh mediums and was told, well, Lando's side of the garage, was told that by Oscar Piastri that mediums were the tyre that he should be on. Why then did McLaren drop the ball yet again strategically as far as their team orders probably isn't the right word, but their strategy? Why are they sabotaging, for want of a better word, Oscar Piastri and making bad decisions in the latter stage of the Grand Prix around Lando Norris's tyre choices? What's fueling that?
Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with splitting. If it's a close call, there's nothing wrong with splitting your options between the two cars. And if there's one option that's slightly better than the other, you'd give it to your favoured number one driver, would you not? And not your relatively young, new Australian driver. That's pretty logical. And I don't think there's anything scurrilous about that. I mean, the radio message I heard was that they actually said to Lando, you got a choice of mediums or softs. Medium if you want to cover Max Verstappen, soft if you want to race Lewis Hamilton. And he, I didn't hear the reply, but I'm assuming he said, give me the softs. And so I think it was Lando's call, and having been given the choice, and I give him 100% for that. Why not? It showed what his intent was. And I think he felt, and I felt, and I think a lot of people would have felt that on the soft tire, if it was going to be marginal over the last 2 or 3 laps of the race, left front wise, that the McLaren would be better at managing its tires than the Mercedes. I would have thought that. As it happened, it was the other way around. And it may be because of that slow pit stop. And it may be because he was therefore in Lewis's slipstream and getting more debris and turbulence from the car. And that's why his tires went off quicker than Lewis's. Maybe. But Lando did say afterwards, even if I'd had a lightning pit stop and I'd been leading the race, he wouldn't have won it. So it looks like he felt it was a chronic issue on the McLaren that was worse than that on the Mercedes.
It's interesting as well in the cool down that Lewis was quite surprised by the fact that Lando didn't choose the mediums, especially since Oscar was going so quickly on them. It's like I beggars belief sometimes with McLaren that they... Yeah,
but it was only the lap before. He didn't know then how quickly Oscar was going on them, did he? I don't think...
Oscar had radioed in and said these mediums, as Oscar does very stoically, that these mediums are good, all right. Yeah. These are the tyres.
But we didn't know how good, though. And we didn't know how quick the soft was going to be, if you see what I mean. And Lando wanted to win that race, just as Lewis wanted to win the race. I mean, you could argue, why did they put Lewis on softs?
I think Lewis only had those left. That was his hand forced, but Lando had the choice of mediums, hard or soft, fresh each. I just think that.
Yeah, you say Lewis, they didn't have anything else left, but they certainly had scrub tires left. And if Mercedes in the past, if they know the soft isn't going to last, and we've seen that with Lewis several times, he's wanted to be on the soft and they haven't let him get on the soft, and they put him on scrub mediums because it's the way to get through to the finish. They obviously felt that they had half a chance, and Lewis, just because of the zone he was in and the way he was driving, they thought, wow, maximize this, go for it. But nobody knew that obviously Lando's pit stop was going to be slow and that he was going to be behind Lewis. So there were a lot of sort of easy comments to make after the events there. But I think Lando made the right call. I wouldn't in any way knock that. I would say certainly if Mercedes are on the soft, if I'd been, I mean, all I can do when I criticize people or other people make criticisms, you've got to put yourself in the position of the engineers on the pit wall. What would you have done? I would have put Lando on softs if
Wow.
I'd seen Lewis on softs, absolutely for sure, because I would have thought he would have beaten Lewis to the finish,
Is this
and he would
is
be better able to manage the tires.
so is their mistake then, Peter, that they haven't realised that this for me, as far as driver capability, the championship is still two tiered. It's massively reminiscent of 2021 in this sense. You have Lewis and Max, and you have the rest. Lando probably is amongst the leaders of the rest, but to expect Lando in the final stages of that Grand Prix to be able to manage his tyres like Lewis Hamilton is like is an exercise in futility, is it not? And so too, I mean, Lando is a brilliant driver, but I don't think he's not quite there yet to go head to head with Max or Lando per his move. He's very speculative move.
You can say that, Cameron. I mean, I wouldn't go that far to say that. I would say that the McLaren was actually worse on the tyres than the Mercedes. And if Lewis had been in a McLaren, I think the tyres would have gone off the same way. I don't think it was as clear cut as you say, the difference between the drivers. I think Lando's exceptionally good, and he's just as good at what Lewis does very well. That, I mean, in on Friday, he was unbelievable going into turn 6, I guess it is, the first left-hander at the end of the first straight, the long straight. He was, I mean, talk about floating in, no brakes, no throttle for longer than anybody else on the track. Just superb, just letting the car settle, Jackie Stewart like. No, Lando's definitely very good at managing tires. And I think it was a McLaren thing that, okay, and I blame the turbulence, to be honest. I think, whoever was, if it's that marginal on tires, I think if you're behind the other car, definitely is going to be much more detrimental to the left front than if you are in clear air. And they had to assume that Lando was going to be leading that race. They never imagined that he would be behind the Mercedes.
Jeez. Too many mistakes. I really want to get behind McLaren.
Oh, I don't know if they were mistakes. I think it was a good call to make at the time. I wouldn't say that was a mistake. Easy to say it on a Monday morning. Oh, well, if you'd made a better pit stop and you're on the medium, you would have won the race. But I think at the time, I don't think it was a mistake.
Fair. But I suppose from Oscar's as an example, your exhibit A per se, Oscar will be like, he's lost circa 10 seconds by keeping him out an additional lap. Why not double stack Oscar for Pete's sake? It's just like, I don't know. I feel like they're showing how green they are as a team, not competing at that level just yet. You don't think?
Yeah. Again, I would have done the same thing.
Wow.
I would have done exactly that. I would have kept him out for another lap because things were changing anyway. And I didn't think it was a bad call. It's marginal, isn't it? The other problem with the stacked pit stop is the propensity for errors as well. And yes, the teams do prepare for them, but in that stage of the race, you wanted it to be absolutely minimizing of any possible dramas. As it happened, there was a drama on Lando's, was it left rear? But I didn't see that. I thought that was the right thing to do. If you don't forget, Oscar Piastri is the young support driver to Lando Norris. He's for sure going to win Grand Prix, this guy. He's really, really good, but he's got a great approach to racing and a great approach to his position in the team and basically doing the job he needs to do all the time. And that's a very rare thing to have. And they're using him well, I think. And I don't think Lando should feel bad about that race at all. I'd be interested to know what happened in the pit stop. I'd be interested to know what happened in the Red Bull pit stop. It's two of the top teams having major similar problems actually in 2 consecutive races.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a function of this triple header and all the service and stuff that needs to be done on the air guns. And I don't know if it's air guns or nuts or whatever it is, but there's something going on there. Yeah. Would it have happened if it wasn't a triple header, the third part of a triple header? That's the next question. All these questions we can ask about that race looking back.
The hypotheticals, Peter, it's genius. Talk to me about Ferrari, because I remember thinking at the start of the season that if anybody were going to mount a challenge on the bulls that are red, that it would be It would be Scuderia Ferrari, but since they've done one of these, haven't they, Peter? Completely dropped off a cliff, and it feels like it's affected Charles Leclerc's performance more to the downside than it has Carlos Sainz Jr. What is happening at Ferrari? What's driving this downward spiral in terms of their performance?
Well, obviously, I don't know any more than they know, because if they knew, they wouldn't be going down. And that whole underfloor business is a mystery to everybody, not just the people from the outside, but also the people designing the floors. It's obviously a mystery because they can't get it right, especially at Ferrari. And as I said, over the winter, I think they did quite a good job of taking out some of their top speed, adding downforce to the car, and giving themselves a bit of a sweet spot in which to drive the car, manage understeer and oversteer, and basically not lose too much in lap time while they're doing that. And they did that. It seemed that they did that very well. And Imola, they made more upgrades, and they didn't. I think that was the turning point. The upgrades they brought to Imola didn't actually manifest themselves in any sort of positive improvement. They picked up a little bit in top speed, but in doing so, they lost that sweet spot. And now they find themselves in a position where they're constantly having to run on the edge of a competitive top speed against a reasonable sweet spot that allows the drivers to do what they want. And Silverstone brought that really to a crisis point, because there are so many medium and high speed corners there that they were just really struggling against that balance between top speed and how much downforce to have on the car and how low to run, obviously. And they just couldn't get it right. It was the conditions at Silverstone were so changeable from beginning of practice on Friday in the wet right through to the end of the race, in terms of crosswind, in terms of wet curbs, dry curbs, grooves, everything else. Very, very difficult. When you've got a car that's that edgy, it's almost impossible to get it right. And that's what it is. They're on a knife edge. They're on the same knife edge that Mercedes were on this time last year, probably. It's just one lap they can get it right, and there'll be a few idiosyncrasies, like it's better on light fuel than heavy fuel, or we used to be good off the line, now we're not good off the line. Things like that, little idiosyncrasies that creep in because they're just on the edge of performance all the time. I got to say, I think Red Bull are not that far away from, at a higher level of grip, but they're not that far away from being on that edge as well. They've always had a big sweet spot at Red Bull. But if you look at Sergio Perez's performance, which is a much better barometer of how near Red Bull are to running on the edge now, the fine edge, the razor thin edge of getting the car perfect, it's obviously very difficult to find that point. And Perez is proving that. And Max even suffered enormously early on in the race, obviously with nothing like enough grip in the car to be able to be confident and throw it around and do what he can normally do. It was only later on that he got the tires to work and was looking pretty good towards the end of the race. But going back to Ferrari, I think on top of all that, you've got two completely different worlds of the two drivers. You've got Charles Leclerc, who wants to be nothing more than a Grand Prix winner and prove that he's quicker than Lewis Hamilton, right up there with Max Verstappen. This is in his mind. And every race when he's struggling to make the top 10 in Q3, or the car doesn't feel right, he's kind of responding by getting emotional and overdriving and making mistakes, which we all thought, I think, all us Charles fans, all thought that he was kind of through and wouldn't be prone to that anymore. Now that his future's secure at Ferrari, he's the anointed one, etc. And yet it's all there, and he's very, very emotional rather than being very calm. And I think, when the car is not going well, mechanics don't want to see the driver getting annoyed. They want to see the driver staying very calm and getting out of the car and talking in a very calm way about everything. And that's not happening. Whereas Carlos Sainz is in a different situation. It's like, well, this team doesn't want me anymore. I'm just going to drive this my own way, do my own thing. I don't really care what they think or what they do. I'm going to do my own thing. And he's actually, as a result, he's driving really well because he has got no pressure from anywhere really other than himself. And that's a good thing. And so he's getting in the car, doing his thing. He's not really listening to what's going on anywhere else in the team, carrying on, having a laugh with, the mechanics or the fans or whatever, enjoying his last few months of being a Ferrari driver. And he's driving well. I mean, compared with Charles Leclerc, he just blew Leclerc away, didn't he? But it wasn't a great day for Ferrari. Having said that, I mean, they were scratching to beat Haas Ferrari all weekend. And then there was that weird thing, this anomaly of Carlos setting fastest lap on his last lap, I think, of the race on softs. I mean, what was that all about?
Yeah, it's complicated, as they say. Peter, I want to pick your brain on Charles Leclerc because the community have said that I'm being very harsh on him by saying, although he's an absolutely brilliant driver, point to point, probably the quickest on the grid, his mistakes, his unforced errors, both the frequency and the extent of them, the fact they will make him, it doesn't make it's not a cheeky spin and then he just carries on. 9 times out of 10, he ends up in the barrier and it's a DNF. I've argued that if anything will be his principal impediment to becoming a driver championship, then that will be it. Now I think there's another unwanted entrant as far as his soft and vulnerable underbelly, being that he allows the ineptitude, both operationally and strategically, of the team to influence his performance, Peter. That if he's operating at 80% and the team are operating at 70%, rather than dragging them kicking and screaming up to 90%, he allows that 80% to become 70%. Do you agree or disagree with that characterization, Peter? I'm keen.
Well, it sounds a bit complicated for my brain. All I would say is that I think he's too emotional. And that, that can manifest itself in what you've just described. It can manifest itself in other ways too. He's just too emotional. He needs to be much calmer. I can't think of a better word. When I think about Alan Prost or Jackie Stewart or Mario Andretti or Carlos Reutemann or Nigel Mansell, for that matter, or Michael Schumacher, or even Sebastian Vettel. I can't think of situations. I mean, Vettel used to get very annoyed with Webber, of course, but not with the team and not with his engineers and not with the way the car was going and not with his own driving in the way that Charles does. Charles lets the emotion of the frustration affect his driving.
Yeah.
And that's something he needs to, he really needs to sit down with Jackie Stewart, I think, because what you need to do in Charles' situation, this doesn't apply to all drivers, what he needs to do, in my opinion, is drain himself of all emotion before he gets in the car. And he's got to be like this completely deflated balloon, as Jackie used to talk about. And everything's got to be instinctive and reactive. And he's got to be like a robot in the car in terms of the administration of the car and running the car. But in terms of his driving and what he's doing in the cockpit, he needs to be absolutely calm and devoid of emotion, because he's an emotional guy, and he needs to work on that. And he needs to work on ways of detuning himself before he gets in the car, rather than, doing all the stuff that they tend to do now, because it's quite sort of trendy, #fashionable to be doing the juggling and the skipping and all that stuff. And, there's a good reason that Jackie Stewart used to sit in the back of the Tyrrell motorhome reading, Transporter actually, reading boring paperbacks. I say boring, it was sort of Neville Shute or Hammond Innes, that sort of thing, Alistair MacLean. And it's because he was dyslexic and it was really difficult for him to read. And he knew it was going to half put him to sleep trying to do it. That's why he did that, because he wanted to feel that sort of empty, I just want to be reactive when I get in the car. I don't want to be emotional because it's going to affect my judgment. And nobody seems to think that way, but I can't think of any driver on the grid who needs to do that more now than Charles Leclerc, in my opinion.
Oof. You said it, Peter. As well, I'd add to that Peter, I think that strategically, if you know that your team has a cheeky unforced error in their locker, like this race weekend when they've told him to go on into several laps too early, surely then as a racing driver, you've got to check their maths in real time, just like Carlos Sainz does. I argued that my pushback to the team, if I was Charles, what's Carlos doing? Because Carlos, in changeable circumstances, very rarely gets it. He's very rarely a million miles away, isn't he? So I feel like the travesty in all this, Peter, as far as Lewis going to Ferrari next year, is that Charles can pick up and learn that kind of strategic assertiveness from Carlos and kind of increase his race IQ. I don't know.
Yeah, I think if I was running Ferrari, I would have said to Charles before the race, changeable conditions, you're in a difficult position on the grid. whatever we think is going to be a bit of a gamble that might help you, we'll take it. Whether it's going to Inters early or whether it's going to staying on slicks for longer, whatever it is, we'll take it, because you're not going to win the race in where you are, Charles. Carlos, slightly different situation. He's a little bit further up the grid. He's got half a chance maybe of getting on the podium. We'll do a more sort of classic, systematic, strategic approach to his race. But in your case, we'll take a lot of risks and just see if we can do something with you and help you up. And I think that's what they did. And I think, there was no downside really in putting him onto Inters as quickly as they did. Who knows? There might have been a sudden rainstorm the next lap, and everybody else's meteorologist might have been wrong, and he might have been leading the race. Who knows? And where he was, I think you can take those risks. Having said all of that, and speaking as the guy who, when Carlos Reutemann looked at me on the grid in the 81 South African Grand Prix and said, wets or dries, and I saw, it wasn't that the sun was breaking through over the top of Leerkop hairpin. It was this, that Carlos is so good. He had Lewis touch and feel in terms of driving in semi-wet conditions. I said, Carlos, I can't even believe you're asking me. Slicks, mate. Why would you even think about running wets? And the track was streaming wet. It was still raining. He left the slicks on. He won the race. And I find it, if you're a good enough driver, and this doesn't apply to, it only applies to about a third of the grid, but if you're good enough, Nico Hulkenberg's another you'd do this with. If you're in any doubt at all about anything when it's weather conditions, you always run slicks, always run slicks. And I can't believe that the risk they took with Leclerc was to put him on Inters early. What they should have done is said, right, forget about the Inters. We're going to give him track position and leave him on the slicks. He's good enough and he's talented enough to be able to drive this thing on slicks. And if we can get him through that whole period, then he might have decent track position. That's the risk I would have taken with him. And I would have told him that. And I said, look, Charles, you're going to be on slicks in the wet for sure, 3 or 4 laps. It's going to be difficult, but you're the talented guy out there. You're going to do it. You can keep the car on the island. Go for it. Instead of which they got into the whole, we've got a strategy department, better listen to them, weather forecaster. It was all wrong. And we saw it in the F3 race. I mean, what were those guys in the F3 race doing on intermediates on a track? I couldn't believe it. I mean, okay, it was wet around the back of the circuit. I get that. But you'd think some of them would have had the gumption to start on slicks and just, know that they got the talent, back themselves, as Steve Waugh would say, and just get on with it and drive a car on slicks in the wet. I mean, for all his failings in a number of areas, the one thing that always impressed me about Dan Ticktum, the other guy who drove into another car behind the safety car, and he lost his license for a year, unlike Sebastian Vettel, and Dan Ticktum made it up to F2. But in his year off, I was always very impressed that his dad hired, I think it was Boyo Double R, to do a lot of days at Pembury. And he said, I don't want him to just go testing. I want him to drive on slicks in the wet. That's what I want. Unless it's wet, don't go testing. Put him on slicks. And I thought, wow, that's a really cool thing to do, because these days everybody's petrified, aren't they? They're petrified to be on slicks in the wet, and it's wrong. You're going to win races if you're the guy that does that well. And going back to that F3 race, I mean, it was just ridiculous how many drivers came in on the end of the formation lap to change. What were they thinking? It's because the teams are all petrified about damaging the cars, I guess, and the cost of repairs and all that stuff. But it's just really... Anyway, going back to Charles, I think Ferrari probably had the right intention of taking a gamble with him, but the logic and the thinking behind the intention was completely skewed 100%. Because it should have been the other way. It should have been keep him on Inters, keep him on slicks for as long as possible.
Yeah.
Because at least he's got the talent to be able to drive. And if the team thinks you've got the talent, you're amazed how the drivers respond to that. Sometimes they don't, but you got to choose the right driver. I wouldn't necessarily do that with Carlos. I wouldn't do it with Sergio Perez. But I might, here's the thing, I might do it with Lance Stroll.
Oof.
So I think he's got quite a lot of feel in the wet.
He's not bad in the wet at all.
I'd do it with Fernando for sure. I'd do it with Fernando, absolutely for sure.
Yeah.
I'd do it with Lewis. I'd do it with Max. I'd do it with Fernando. I'd do it with Charles. And I'd probably do it with Lando, providing I briefed him in advance of what we were going to be doing and how to handle it. I wouldn't spring it on Lando, let's put it that way.
No, you wouldn't want to do that. Lando's is an expectation.
I'd do it on Oscar. I'd do it on Oscar too.
For 100%.
Sure.
100%. Speaking about being good enough, Peter, Checo Perez has fallen on performance hard times, failing periodically to get out of Q1 in an RB20 that Max has clearly displayed he's one of the best cars on the grid currently. He's been out qualified now 5 times career to date by Logan Sargent in the Williams. As a
Really, that's a good stat, isn't it?
crazy, eh? Were you his team manager, Peter? How would that very difficult conversation go?
Well, I'd be ringing Rob Wilson and booking. I'd be saying, Rob, cancel your next 3 months. Get rid of everybody else. You're doing 3 months with Sergio Perez, 3 days a week,
Oof.
all day. That's all you can do with a guy like Perez. There's nothing else that can take him to another level of consistency and pace on an easier circuit. I mean, Silverstone's about the worst possible circuit for Sergio Perez because there's nowhere he can really be Sergio apart from coming out of the hairpins, and the road's very wide there. So traction there isn't a great thing. Everything else he's not very good at. Medium, high speed corners, no thanks. And so he was never going to be good around Silverstone unless the car was absolutely brilliant. And it wasn't brilliant. So no wonder he was struggling from beginning to end. So that's where you're at with Perez. When it gets to a reasonably easy circuit, I mean, Hungary, he'll be all right in Hungary, I think, because there's quite a lot of traction episodes in Hungary. It's not that difficult a circuit. Yeah. And he might struggle through that quick left-hander, but everywhere else, no, there's that right-hander at the top as well, isn't there? The quick one towards the end of the lap, and that'll be a problem for him. But everywhere else, he'll be all right. It's not that difficult if you've got a good car with good grip. And Sergio, as I say, he's got that great quality of his traction, how he puts the power down when things are going well. So that's good. So, and he'll be quite good on the last corner in Hungary, which is not an easy corner. He'll be quite good at just making that corner nothing more than a traction episode and just getting in not too quickly, just making sure he's got the car nicely rotated, and he'll be really good on exit from there. So I suspect he'll be quite good in Hungary. Spa depends on weather, depends on how the Red Bull actually is, but it won't be as bad as Silverstone because there are longer corners there, and a lot of them are kind of landlocked, and you just sort of do what you do. And Eau Rouge, he might be a little bit slower than Max, but not really. I mean, it's flat anyway in the dry, isn't it? Pouhon, he'll be okay around Pouhon. It's a long corner. It's a very different corner to anything you got at Silverstone. Silverstone, as I say, is about the worst possible circuit for Sergio Perez.
Yeah, he doesn't like the old.
Yeah, I mean, I never imagined he was going to go well there, to be honest. It didn't surprise me at all that he was in trouble.
Sadly for him, though, Peter, his team principal said quite clearly that Checo will need a performance in the race at the British Grand Prix. So bad has his performance been. There's performance clauses that's been leaked. And again, as at the summer break, he's not meeting either one of them. I think they're going to make a decision imminently. I wouldn't be surprised post the summer break to see a Daniel Rick in that car. Liam Lawson is testing. He's doing 2 private tests, isn't he? Both in Red Bull, not RB Visa Cash App.
If they're going to put anybody in, I would have thought it'd be Liam Lawson.
Wow.
And not Daniel. I would have thought, purely because Daniel's not going very well at the moment, is he?
No.
He and his team are having a problem. I don't know who we are, but he's having a problem, according to Daniel. And I mean, if he's got performance clauses in his contract, that's a very unusual thing. I'd be interested to know what the actual wording was of those, because, as I said before, I mean, legally, I can't even imagine what sort of minefield that is, because you'd be really struggling, I think, in any performance clause to separate the performance of the driver from the performance of the car and any other issues that may or may not be affecting either of them. So that's a difficult one. If they're actually going to tear up his contract based on performance clauses not being met, I can see that being a legal nightmare. I'm surprised they've even done that, to be honest. But anyway, if they do replace him, I would suggest it would be Liam. But I think he'll go quite well in Hungary. So not just because he's had a kick in the pants or whatever, but because I think it's quite an easy circuit and he'll be all right around there in a good car.
Yeah, here's hoping, Peter. I feared, however, that Hungary and Spa could be his last run. I feel like this is a stay of execution now.
They could be, but then you got to still remember why they're re-signing him anyway. They're not re-signing him to be mega quick and to be number 2, finishing second on the road to Max all the time. They're signing him because he's a fairly inconsequential guy to have in the other car that Max doesn't have to think about. Otherwise, they'd have somebody quicker and with more, penetration. they want a guy like that. So we should all be a little bit careful about judging his performance purely on pace. As I say, I think get to some of the easier circuits, he'll be right there again, as where he needs to be, let's put it that way. But if you're taking the decision to have a guy like Perez in the other car, he's a guy like Perez, you know, and that's Max still finished second, didn't he? And that's the way they like that team balanced. That's why Max wouldn't have George Russell in the other car, because he wants a guy like Sergio Perez. And he does bring a lot of money, as I pointed out before. So you tell me how many guys out there who've won Grand Prix, who have the knowledge of the inner workings of the team in terms of the sim and doing stuff that they need done back at the factory, who brings that much money to the team. Who else is there out there?
No one.
Nobody, exactly. So in a way, they're quite lucky to have the guy.
Yeah, you're right, Peter. But I think that it's the extent of the underperformance that's going to cause them issues. When you look at it, go on, there's a cheeky stat here that I've just pulled up.
Mm-hmm.
Compared to Hulkenberg, over the last 6 races, Hulkenberg scored 8 points. Checo Perez has scored 0. Sorry, Great Britain, Hulkenberg 8, Perez 0. Austria, Hulkenberg 8, Perez 7. So if you're being outperformed by Hulkenberg and Logan Sargent in a Haas and a Williams respectively, surely then
But that's no surprise. I mean, when they were together at Force India, Hulkenberg was always really good alongside Perez. But here's the thing. Max wouldn't want Hulkenberg because he's number 2 driver. If you had the choice of Perez or Hulkenberg, I'm sure if the team pointed out also about how much money Perez brings, Max will say, yeah, Checo's fine. He's no problem. Blah, blah, blah. Why would he want somebody quick and annoying in the other car?
Yeah.
It's not going to get the best from him. You know, it just isn't. It's a fact. It's a fact. You know, this is experience of knowing and working with some of the great drivers of all time. All of them want to have a relatively quiet, submissive guy in the other car. They don't want to have an Alan Prost or a Keke Rosberg or a Nelson Piquet or an Ayrton Senna if you're Alan Prost. And so it goes on. And that's logical. Why wouldn't you? Max has earned that position, that right to be the strength in the team, just as Lewis had earned that right. And that's one of the things I've always said, you know, he earned that right to be able to say, I want to keep Valtteri in the other car. And they didn't do it. And that's one of the things he had to live with after Abu Dhabi 21. And it's again, it's no surprise. I mean, if I was Max Verstappen, I wouldn't want to have anybody quick in the other car either. I'd want to focus on doing the job and beating all the opposition, not beating my teammate all the time.
Yeah. That bandwidth, some say, as far as F1 drivers, is the currency, right? You just want to be able to focus on driving the car.
It's a logical 100%. Thing. And, you know, anybody who doesn't grasp that doesn't understand motor racing. Certainly doesn't understand Formula One, that's for sure.
Oh, dear. Super generous of your time as always, Mr. Windsor. Let me ask you a final question just to circle back to where we started. In the video, you said something that had me tearing up, Mr. Windsor. You said if Jimmy Clark were watching that, he would have said of Lewis Hamilton, his victory, the 25 points that he gained at the British Grand Prix, that was a win. Explain what you mean, Peter.
Well, it was just that I think that was a win worthy of Jim Clark, worthy of everything that Jimmy did at Silverstone. And he was a multi-winner as well, of course. And, you know, there was everything in that win we saw yesterday. There was the changeable weather. There were the different tyres. There was the nursing of the soft tyre over the last 10 laps. And there was the opposition that he had to beat. Okay, George retired, which made things a little bit easier. But he had to beat Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri, and Max Verstappen. You know, it doesn't get much better than that, really. Okay, Charles Leclerc, wasn't there. So to me, that was a win of enormous quality with so many different components. A classic Jim Clark win, because Jim's wins were never easy. You know, it was either switching off the engine over the last 5 laps so that to save the pistons because the oil pressure was going, or, you know, the rear suspension collapsed, so he's got a puncture, or he's lost third gear. It was always that sort of thing. And I just thought, you know, that cap he was wearing, I mean, we know it was a Brazilian green and yellow. It was the Ayrton Senna 30th year, but also it's green and yellow of Team Lotus. That's what struck me at Silverstone. And I immediately thought about Jimmy in the 25, the 33, the 49 in green and yellow, and how Jimmy would have watched that race if he'd been with us and watching that race. He would have thought, wow, that was a serious Grand Prix win. He would have approved. It was a win of the stature of Jim Clark.
Mr. Windsor. To say that Jim Clark would have approved, there is, of course, no higher praise. I love that. And again, watching back that Peter Windsor video on your YouTube channel, I couldn't watch it without shedding a cheeky tear. Of course, in the name of hay fever, because grown men do not cry. Mr. Windsor, you've been an absolute legend. Honestly, I enjoy these conversations. Super insightful. If you want to hear more from Peter D. Windsor and you are not subscribed to that fella's YouTube channel, what are you doing with your life? How dare you call yourself an F1 fan? If you enjoy Peter Windsor's soliloquy, the eloquence, the insight, go and check him out on all good podcasting platforms, the Short Corners podcast. If you're watching this on the YouTubes, give us a like, give us a follow and share and a comment. If you're listening on a podcasting platform, 5 stars and a cheeky review as always. Mr. Windsor, you've been a legend each and every
Cameron,
single
if
time.
I can just interject just before the end. What about our WhatsApp interchange then before the race?
You know what, Peter? I wanted to drop it in. Go on, I'll tell this story because it's a brilliant anecdote. As I do periodically, I was harassing Mr. Windsor's life before the race, and I wanted to get an insight as to. I was actually looking at the odds, Peter, because I quite fancied Max. I felt like they'd tapered off of his odds, so I text Mr. Windsor. I was like, Peter, who do you fancy for this race? And instantly, Mr. Windsor texts back, one word answer: Lewis. I was like, oh my gosh.
I think I had a muscle sign as well, didn't I?
Yeah, one of these, Peter. Yeah. I was like, and true to form, Mr. Windsor, you're never a million miles away from the truth.
It wasn't that difficult to predict it, to be honest. Wow. How well he'd driven in qualifying and how well the car was going and the conditions. It had Lewis written all over it, I thought, that weekend.
Insight. There are levels and there are levels to insight, Peter D. Windsor. And your 10,000 hours worth of deliberate practice in and around the sport clearly manifests in your ability to Nostradamus these predictions. You see these things. You're a legend, Peter. I've been Cameron F1. That's been Mr. Peter D. Windsor. Put some respect on his name. Between now and next time, as always, remember to look but never stare.